The beginning of a complicated relationship. Sarah Williams was a 35-year-old woman from Los Angeles who had lived through her fair share of challenges. Once happily married, she found herself divorced and trying to rebuild her life, starting from scratch in a small suburban neighborhood. A promotion at her marketing job had brought her to a new city in sunny California, but loneliness shadowed her attempts at a fresh start. She often spent her weekends shopping in thrift stores, walking her German Shepherd named Max, or grabbing a quick cup of coffee at the corner cafe. It was here, just a few blocks from her modest one-bedroom apartment, that she first met John Miller. John was only 23, visibly younger, yet he possessed a confidence that came from his laid-back charm. He worked the late shift at a 24/7 convenience store near Sarah's daily commute. They first spoke when John remarked on her choice of bubblegum, an old-school brand he hadn't seen anyone buy in years. "You buying this ironically?" he teased, popping the wrapper on a candy bar behind the counter. Sarah chuckled, slightly caught off guard. "Not really, it's nostalgic. The simpler days when life wasn't so messy." John tilted his head with genuine interest. "Simpler days? I don't know about you, but my childhood wasn't exactly easygoing." This casual remark turned their quick exchange into a deeper, albeit surprising, conversation. Sarah found herself staying longer than expected at the counter, listening as John shared bits about his life, a small-town guy from Oklahoma who had left home after high school, chasing the dream of figuring himself out in California. He lived paycheck to paycheck, working night shifts, but carried a contagious optimism. "Do you believe in fate?" John asked her at one point, leaning on the counter as if sharing a secret. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Fate? I believe we create our own path. Life hasn't exactly handed things to me on a silver platter, you know?" "That's the thing," John mused, grinning. "Maybe fate doesn't hand it to you, but it nudges you into the right convenience store, at least once in a while." Although she initially laughed it off, Sarah couldn't help but feel oddly drawn to his carefree humor. Here was this young, seemingly uncomplicated man in her otherwise structured, monotonous life. He was worlds apart from the corporate type Sarah usually interacted with, the kind who would size up the cost of your handbag before even learning your name. With John, there were no pretenses, and that captivated her. Their casual conversations at the store became more frequent. Sarah started stopping by after work, picking up small items she didn't really need, snacks for Max, a pack of gum, lotto tickets. On one particular Tuesday evening when the store was unexpectedly empty, John stepped around the counter. "You're one of the only regulars who doesn't just come in and complain about their day," he said, adjusting his flannel shirt like he was trying to muster courage. "How about letting me buy you coffee sometime, somewhere other than this place?" Sarah hesitated. It wasn't the first time someone had asked her out since her divorce, but something about John's youthful ease made it feel different, and risky. She was vulnerable, unsure, but undeniably intrigued by his sincerity. "All right," she finally replied with a small smile, "but only if you let me treat Max to a puppuccino while we're at it." Their first date at a local dog park was a whimsical mix of spontaneity and awkward charm. Max, sensing Sarah's hesitation, stayed protectively close to her. John managed to coax a few laughs out of her with stories of customers trying to bargain for snacks or mistaking the store's taco sauce for hot fudge. "I like this," Sarah admitted after a while, watching Max chase butterflies under the evening glow. "This?" John asked, eyes twinkling. "This, not being judged, not worrying about whether I'm saying all the right things, it's just natural." John smiled, twirling a fallen leaf between his fingers. "Yeah, natural's good." What started as an experiment in escaping her structured, predictable life quickly spiraled into something deeper. Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, talking about her failed marriage, her fear of putting herself out there again, and her uncertainty about the future. John, in turn, shared dreams of starting his own business someday, his struggles to keep his reckless streak in check, and his long-standing dreams of leaving the retail grind. While their differences were undeniable, age, life experience, financial stability, there was something magnetic about their connection. Friends and family quickly began to notice the budding relationship and voiced their concerns. Sarah's sister Emily rolled her eyes during a phone call one evening. "A 23-year-old? Seriously, Sarah, what could you two possibly have in common?" "It's not about common ground, Em," Sarah shot back, pacing her living room. "It's about understanding each other in ways that matter." "Or about filling some void with whatever young distraction comes along," Emily retorted sharply. "You're above this, Sarah." Even her best friend Rachel tried to voice her doubts more subtly. Over brunch one Sunday, Rachel leaned closer, lowering her mimosa. I get it, he's charming in that young and free kind of way. But Sarah, you have to ask yourself, where's this really going? Sarah would mull over those questions late at night but always shied away from the answers. John made her forget all that felt heavy in her life. He made her laugh, brought back her sense of adventure, made her feel wanted. But what she didn't realize, or perhaps deliberately ignored, was that foundations built on fleeting emotions often crumble. Their relationship, born out of spontaneous attraction and the promise of escape, would soon reveal cracks that neither of them were prepared to mend. Family conflicts and Sarah's blind devotion. The first time Sarah's family heard about John, their reaction wasn't exactly warm. It started with an innocent remark during a family dinner at her mother Elizabeth's home. Sarah had mentioned meeting someone new, a kind, down-to-earth guy who made her laugh. Curious but cautious, her younger sister Emily pressed her for details. "So, who is he, Sarah? And don't try to brush me off this time," Emily said, stabbing at her salad with her fork. Sarah stirred her iced tea, avoiding Emily's piercing gaze. "His name's John," she said softly, a small smile curving on her lips. "He works at the convenience store near my place." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow from across the table. "Convenience store?" she said slowly, as if weighing the words. "And how old is he?" Sarah hesitated for a split second but decided to answer truthfully. "He's 23. But age doesn't matter, Mom. He's mature in ways most people my age aren't." Emily choked on her wine and laughed. 23? That's practically a kid, Sarah, she exclaimed. "You've got to be kidding me. What could a guy his age possibly bring to the table?" "He brings honesty, Emily," Sarah snapped, her voice rising above the quiet hum of the dining room. "He doesn't judge me, doesn't care about my past or whether I'm divorced. He cares about me for me." Elizabeth sighed and placed her fork down delicately, the stern motherly expression Sarah knew all too well settling over her face. "Sweetheart, it's not about judgment, it's about compatibility, about building a future. I'm not saying you need a wealthy businessman or whatever, but let's be realistic here. How much do you know about him?" Sarah's cheeks flushed red. She bowed her head, her shoulders tensing. "Enough," she said, her voice calm but with a clear edge of defiance. "I know enough about him to know this is real, Mom." "Real?" Emily interjected, crossing her arms. "Sarah, come on, you've been alone for a while and I get that. But don't you think you're projecting things onto this guy? He's 23, working night shifts at a convenience store. What's his plan in life? What happens when he wakes up one day and realizes he doesn't want to be with someone who's, let's be honest, practically in a different stage of life than him?" Sarah shot her sister a glare. "Wow, Emily, thank you for that brutal reminder of where I'm at in life," she said sarcastically, her voice quivering with emotion. "And for your information, he does have plans. He wants to start his own business someday. He's working hard to make things happen." Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice softer now but still firm. "We're not saying this to hurt you, honey. We're just concerned. Relationships can't survive on charm and promises of someday. You've been through so much already. The last thing I want is to see you hurt again." But Sarah was done listening. She pushed her chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the wooden floor. "You know what? Maybe you should trust me for once. I've got this under control," she said coldly, grabbing her purse and storming out of the dining room. Over the following weeks, Sarah's relationship with her family became increasingly strained. Emily and Elizabeth would occasionally text her, asking how things were going or if she wanted to join them for lunch. But Sarah always declined, feeling judged before the conversations even started. John, noticing her shifted mood one evening, as they watched a late-night movie on her couch, gently nudged her. "What's going on, Sarah? You've been looking at your phone like it's going to attack you," he joked, offering her a lopsided grin. She sighed, throwing her phone onto the coffee table. "It's my mom and my sister," she admitted. "They don't get us, John, they don't get you. I tried explaining, but all they see is some stereotypical younger guy with no future, like that's all you'll ever be." John scratched the back of his head awkwardly but quickly wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "What people think doesn't matter," he said firmly. "The only thing that matters is what we feel, right? You know me and I know you. That's enough." Sarah leaned into him, desperately wanting to believe his words were all that mattered. "I just hate how they make me feel like I'm doing something wrong," she whispered. "They don't see the you I see," John said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've got this fire, Sarah, don't let them put it out. People who love you should want you to be happy, not tear you down." His words felt like a balm to her bruised heart, and at that moment, Sarah resolved to cut out the negativity, even if it came from her family. Months later, the wedge between Sarah and her family grew deeper. Elizabeth hardly called anymore, believing that Sarah needed to figure it out on her own, and Emily's occasional texts were passive-aggressive at best. Rachel, Sarah's best friend, tried to play neutral ground but finally voiced her concerns after Sarah canceled their monthly brunch for the third time in a row. "I'm starting to feel like I don't know you anymore," Rachel admitted during a phone call. "You've been pulling away from everyone who cares about you, and it all seems to tie back to him." "Rachel, you're being dramatic," Sarah said dismissively. "I'm happy, okay? For the first time in years I'm actually happy. I'm sorry if that doesn't fit into whatever image you have of me." "But are you really happy?" Rachel pressed. "Or are you just grasping onto something that feels good in the moment because you don't want to be alone?" The question hung in the air like a cold draft, but Sarah refused to entertain the thought. She muttered a quick excuse, ending the call abruptly. John was sitting at her kitchen counter, watching her carefully. "What did she want?" he asked casually. "Nothing important," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Just more people thinking they know what's best for me." Sarah didn't realize it yet, but the more she trusted John, the more isolated she became. And with every cut-off call and canceled visit, she unknowingly placed herself in a fragile, precarious position where John was becoming the center of her world. Her blind devotion wasn't just a declaration of love, it was the first step in a dangerous fall toward losing herself entirely. Love leading to financial borrowing. It started innocently. At first it barely registered as lending. Sarah simply wanted to help John out. After all, he was young, working a minimum-wage job at the convenience store, and had dreams of starting his own business. She admired his ambition. "How could I not support that?" she'd tell herself. The first request came on a quiet Wednesday night at Sarah's apartment. They were curled up on her worn-out leather couch, a half-empty pizza box on the coffee table between them, the remnants of a lazy dinner date. John leaned back and exhaled deeply, staring at the ceiling. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, casually sipping her glass of wine. She'd started to pick up on the small tells, his furrowed brow, that nervous tapping of his fingers on the armrest, the way his jaw tightened. "Yeah," John muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just, I've been trying to save up enough to pay my car insurance this month, but it's tight. Bills keep stacking up, you know." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable voicing the concern. "I picked up extra hours at the store, but even with that," his voice trailed off. Sarah tilted her head, offering a small, supportive smile. "Why didn't you say anything sooner? How much are you short?" John hesitated, his pride visibly clashing with his need to confide in her. "Not a lot, just a couple $100. I hate asking, Sarah. I feel like an idiot even bringing it up. I mean, we haven't been together that long." "Don't be silly," Sarah interrupted, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You're working hard. Everyone hits a rough patch sometimes, and it's not like you're out blowing money on stupid stuff. If it helps ease some stress for you, I'm happy to lend it." "Really?" John's eyes lit up with a boyish gratitude that tugged at Sarah's heart. "You don't have to do that, you know. I'll pay you back, I swear." "John, I trust you," Sarah said reassuringly, brushing off his concerns. "It's not a big deal." Over the next few months, similar situations arose. John asked for help covering rent one month when his roommate unexpectedly moved out. Then, it was a new set of tires for his aging car, the same car he drove to work every night, he reminded her. After that, it was a small sum to order prototype parts for an app idea he'd been talking about endlessly. Each time, Sarah convinced herself it was reasonable. John always said the right things, ensuring her that this wasn't permanent. "Just until I get back on my feet," he'd say, holding her hand, looking at her with those warm, earnest eyes. "It means so much to have someone who believes in me." But the amounts grew larger, and each promise to pay her back began to feel more distant. Sarah started to notice patterns. One evening they sat at a diner down the street, a place they frequented because it didn't break the bank, as John liked to joke. But tonight the atmosphere felt heavier. Sarah poked at her Cobb salad while John batted around fries on his plate. "So," Sarah began hesitantly, trying to keep her tone light, "about the money from last month. Have you had a chance to figure out when you might pay some of it back?" John glanced up, his jaw tightening. He looked almost annoyed. "I knew this was coming," he muttered under his breath. "What's that supposed to mean?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "I mean, Sarah," he said, sighing deeply, "I thought you were helping me because you wanted to, not because you had some sort of timeline." Sarah blinked, taken aback. Of course I wanted to help John, but it's starting to feel like I've been doing a lot of heavy lifting here. You said this was temporary, but it's been months. I am working on it, John said defensively, leaning back in the booth. But, you know my situation. I'm not exactly rolling in cash right now. And honestly, I thought we had the kind of relationship where we had each other's backs. If the roles were reversed, I'd do it for you in a heartbeat. The words stung. Sarah flushed with guilt, even though deep down she knew she wasn't wrong to bring it up. Still, she didn't press further that night. As time went on, John's requests became bolder. I found this online course about launching your own business, he said one Saturday morning, scrolling through his phone while sitting on Sarah's kitchen counter. It's perfect for what I've been talking about, pitching ideas to investors, branding strategies, all of it. The only problem is the cost. Sarah looked up from her cup of coffee. How much are we talking? Like $2,000, but it's totally worth it, John said quickly, as if trying to convince her before she could react. I read all the reviews. People are finding funding for their startups within months of taking this thing. Sarah's stomach dropped. John, that's a lot of money. I know, he said earnestly, hopping off the counter to sit beside her. But think about what this could mean for us, for our future. Once this business takes off, it's not just about me, it's about us having the life we've talked about. Don't you see that? Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that every dollar she handed over was an investment in their shared dreams. And maybe, just maybe, it would all pay off eventually. By the time Sarah's savings dwindled to uncomfortable levels, the tension in their relationship grew. She started avoiding her online banking app, unable to face the reality of how much of her hard-earned money had gone to keeping John afloat. John, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to her sacrifice, or worse, he saw it as his due. You'd tell me, right, if this was bothering you? He asked one night, lying on her couch with his feet propped up on the coffee table. Sarah forced a smile, even as doubt gnawed at her insides. Of course, she said softly, but she didn't. And John didn't stop asking. By now, Sarah had not only dipped into her small rainy day fund, but had also begun using her credit card to cover some of John's emergencies. Her family didn't know, how could they? She could already imagine Emily's smug face and Elizabeth's disapproving lecture. You're letting that boy bleed you dry, Emily's voice played on a loop in Sarah's mind. It was easier to stay quiet, but the weight of her secrecy was suffocating. Every charged dollar, every unfulfilled promise from John added to the invisible wall between Sarah and the life she once had. The question was no longer about when she might see the money again. It was about how far she was willing to go for a man who seemed to take more than he gave. The breaking point. When the truth unravels. It started with something small. Sarah had never been the prying type, but one Thursday evening, as she cleaned up the coffee table, John's phone buzzed with a new message. It lit up with a woman's name Sarah didn't recognize, Julie. Her hands momentarily froze over the empty pizza box she was picking up. For a second she dismissed it. It could have been anyone, a coworker, a friend. But the unease crept in the way it does when something doesn't feel quite right. She told herself not to overthink, yet the name lingered in her mind like an uninvited guest. A week later, Sarah was feeding Max in the kitchen when John's phone buzzed again. But this time he scrambled faster than usual to grab it. "Who's texting you at dinner?" she asked casually, her voice light but probing. John hesitated, just for the briefest second, before shrugging. "Oh, just a buddy from work. We're trying to switch some shifts around." Sarah nodded, pretending to accept the answer. But deep down, something shifted. That weekend an opportunity presented itself at a time when John wasn't home. His phone was left on the counter, carelessly unlocked. Sarah hesitated, the polite boundaries of trust warring with the gnawing pit of doubt in her stomach. Knowing she shouldn't, she picked it up and scrolled through his texts. At first it was harmless, a string of mundane conversations about work and grocery lists. But then she found the message thread with Julie. Her breath hitched as she read, "Julie. So, are we still on for tomorrow night? Can't wait to see you. John. Wouldn't miss it. You're the best part of my week." The phone nearly slipped from Sarah's hands. Her mind raced to connect dots she didn't even know were there. Tomorrow night? What was he talking about? It felt like her chest was caving in. She scrolled further, unable to stop herself, each message hitting harder than the last, each flirtation stabbing deeper into the trust she'd placed in him. When John returned that evening, Sarah was sitting at the dining table, his phone tight in her grip. The sight of her and the silence in the room made him pause in the doorway. "What's up?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his tone betrayed him. She raised the phone, her face unreadable. "So, Who the hell is Julie? John's face visibly paled for a moment before he recovered, leaning against the frame of the kitchen door with a forced laugh. Julie? She's just a friend from the store. We hang out sometimes with the crew. Why? Sarah slammed the phone onto the table, the screen still alight with their messages. Don't you dare lie to me, John. These don't look like texts to a friend. John froze, his jaw tightening. For the first time in their relationship, he looked caught, like a deer in headlights. But instead of apologizing, he straightened up defensively. So, what? You went through my phone? He snapped, deflecting immediately. That's completely out of line, Sarah. I thought you trusted me. She shot out of her chair, the anger bubbling over like a volcano about to erupt. Don't you turn this on me. I trusted you, yes, I trusted you so much that I ignored every red flag, every warning sign, and you— Her voice cracked, betraying the overwhelming hurt beneath the fury. You were sneaking around behind my back with her? John rubbed the back of his neck, his voice lowering as if trying to plead his case. Look, Julie and I are just— He struggled to find the right words. We're just talking, that's all, nothing's even happened. Oh, so you're just emotionally cheating? That's supposed to make me feel better? Sarah shot back, her voice trembling. Do you think I'm stupid, John? Do you think I wouldn't figure it out? It's not like that, okay? John's voice rose, frustration and guilt battling in his tone. It's complicated. Oh, I'm sure it is, Sarah laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. She pointed at him, her hands shaking with rage and heartbreak. I gave so much to you, John. I believed in you when no one else did. I stood by you when my family was telling me you weren't worth it. And this is what I get? Some cheap affair with another woman? Julie's she listens, all right? John finally snapped, throwing his hands up in exasperation. She doesn't nag me. She doesn't make me feel like I'm constantly failing. She just makes things feel easier sometimes. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Sarah. It just happened. Sarah turned away from him, staring blankly at the wall, her breathing shallow as the weight of his words sank in. Easier, she repeated softly, as if the word itself had struck a nerve. You think love is supposed to be easy? You think real relationships are about running to the first person who flatters your ego instead of working through the hard parts? John didn't respond, his silence damning. That night Sarah didn't sleep. Her mind replayed every moment of their relationship, every sacrifice she'd made, every dollar she'd spent, every dream she'd foolishly believed in with John. The man who had once made her feel alive now made her feel small, betrayed, and utterly alone. The next morning, as John tried to make amends, approaching her cautiously, Sarah turned to him coldly. You need to leave. Sarah, come on, he began, his voice soft and apologetic, but she held up a hand to stop him. I'm serious, John. Pack your things. You don't get to stay here and keep taking advantage of me after everything you've done. I don't care how sorry you are. Sar, don't do this. Don't call me that, she snapped, her voice sharp and final. Just go. John stared at her for a long moment as if weighing his options before finally turning and heading to the bedroom to gather his belongings. When the door finally slammed shut behind him, Sarah collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion and grief consuming her completely. This was the breaking point for Sarah, the moment she saw John for who he truly was. And while she had kicked him out of her apartment, the emotional wounds he'd left behind were far from healed. A mistaken decision, despair, and revenge. In the days following John's departure, Sarah's apartment buzzed with a suffocating silence. The space, once filled with John's careless laughter and scattered belongings, now felt like a hollow, empty shell. Max, her German shepherd, seemed to sense her grief, resting his head on her lap as she sat on the couch, staring blankly at the flickering TV screen. Sarah had always been proud of her ability to move forward. After her divorce, she had rebuilt her life piece by piece, but this felt different. She had ignored every warning, every red flag, and now she was left not just embarrassed but enraged. Why does he get to walk away like nothing happened, she muttered to herself, running her fingers through Max's fur. Her voice cracked, heavy with a mixture of anger and despair. After everything I gave him, everything I sacrificed. That evening, her best friend Rachel called, likely having heard through the grapevine that something had gone wrong. Sarah let the phone ring a few times before finally answering. Hey, I was starting to think you weren't going to pick up, Rachel said cautiously. Sorry, Sarah replied dully. I've just been dealing with things. There was a moment of silence before Rachel's voice softened. I heard John moved out. Are you okay? Sarah paused, feeling the lump in her throat swell. No, she admitted. I'm not okay, Rach. He lied to me. He used me. I feel so stupid. "You're not stupid, Sarah," Rachel said firmly. "He's a manipulative jerk who took advantage of your kindness, but—" Her voice shifted, tinged with concern. "You need to let it go. Don't let him keep hurting you even now. He's not worth it." "Let it go?" Sarah repeated bitterly. Her grip on the phone tightened as anger bubbled up in her chest. "I gave him everything, Rachel. My trust, my money, my time. He doesn't just get to walk away and move on with his life like I'm some chapter he can just close." "Sarah, I get that you're upset." "Upset?" Sarah yelled, her voice trembling. "Upset doesn't even begin to cover it. He's out there laughing, probably with her while I'm here picking up the pieces. I want him to feel what I'm feeling. I want him to hurt, Rachel." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her tone was wary. "Sarah, you're scaring me. Don't do anything you'll regret, please." "I have to go," Sarah said abruptly, hanging up before Rachel could say more. That night, lying awake in bed, Sarah's mind raced through memories of John. The way he had looked at her when he needed something, his voice dripping with promises of a brighter future. And then a newer memory took over. The text messages, Julie's name on his screen, the way he had defended her after betraying Sarah's trust. Her grief twisted into something darker, a need for justice, or perhaps vengeance. The next day, as she scrolled mindlessly through her phone, she snapped at the sight of a photo Julie had posted online. It wasn't much, just a plate of food at a trendy Los Angeles restaurant. But Sarah recognized the style, the lighting, even the table. It was a place John had once taken her. Her hand trembled as she stared at the image. She could feel her pulse pounding in her head. Without thinking, she grabbed her keys and stormed out the door. Late that evening, Sarah found herself parked outside John's new apartment. It wasn't hard to find. He hadn't exactly hidden his new address when he posted about some furniture he had bought on social media. She stared up at the building, her thoughts a jumble. "Just confront him," she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel. "Tell him what he's done, the pain he's caused." But the rational side of her mind was quickly drowned out by the burning anger that had taken root in her heart. The front door opened, and Sarah froze. There he was, John, laughing as he walked outside, with Julie. The sight of them together, so carefree, so oblivious to the wreckage he had left behind, was like gasoline on a fire. She got out of the car without realizing it, her feet carrying her toward them before her brain could catch up. "John!" she called, her voice sharp and startling in the quiet street. He turned, surprised. "Sarah? What the hell are you doing here?" Julie glanced at Sarah nervously before stepping behind John. "I want to talk," Sarah said coldly, her eyes burning holes into him. "This isn't the time or place," John said, his voice low, as if trying to hide her presence from Julie. "You need to go." "I gave you everything," Sarah shouted, her voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. She could feel the tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't care. "I trusted you, I believed in you, and this is how you repay me. You made me look like a fool." "Sarah, calm down," John said, his tone growing impatient. "This isn't the way to handle this." "Oh, but lying and cheating is the right way, huh?" Her voice cracked with the sheer force of her anger. "You used me, John. You took everything I had, and then you threw me away like I was nothing." Julie stepped forward, her voice tentative. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but maybe—" "This doesn't concern you," Sarah snapped, cutting her off. Her rage was blinding now, spilling over in waves she couldn't control. John raised his hand, signaling Julie to step back. "All right, that's enough," he said, his tone firm. "You need to leave, Sarah, just leave." But Sarah didn't leave. Not yet. She didn't plan for what came next, but later, as she sat in her car clutching the steering wheel, her knuckles white and her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps, she realized she had stepped into dangerous territory. Her emotions had taken control, and she wasn't sure if she could pull herself back from the edge. Her despair, her heartbreak, and her thirst for revenge had only just begun to surface, and the line between right and wrong was starting to blur. A tragedy unfolds, the argument that led to murder. Late one night, weeks after John's betrayal and Sarah's growing descent into anger and heartbreak, she found herself outside John's apartment again. Max whimpered softly beside her in the passenger seat, as if sensing the turmoil in her heart. The crisp night air seemed too quiet, too still, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Sarah. "This is just to get closure," she muttered to herself, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I need to make him understand what he's done to me." As if on autopilot, she got out of the car, leaving Max behind, and climbed the steps to John's apartment. Her heart pounded louder with each step, and by the time she reached his door her anger had overtaken her hesitation. She banged on it with the side of her fist. "John, open the door, I'm not leaving until we talk." From the other side she heard shuffling and then his irritated voice. "What the hell, Sarah, it's late!" The door opened a crack, revealing John's annoyed face. But when he saw Sarah standing there, her eyes red, her face pale, his annoyance gave way to a wary tension. "Why are you here?" he asked sharply, glancing down the hallway like he was worried someone might see. "We need to talk," Sarah insisted, pushing the door open wider with a force that surprised even her. "I'm not walking away this time, John." John sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You're making this worse for yourself, you know that? You need to move on. What part of it's over, don't you understand?" Sarah laughed bitterly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Move on? Move on? After you used me, cheated on me, and threw me away like garbage? You don't get to tell me to move on, John. You owe me answers." John closed the door behind her, lowering his voice. "Keep it down. Julie's asleep in the next room. You're seriously going to show up here in the middle of the night and cause a scene?" The mention of Julie's name was like pouring gasoline on the fire already burning inside Sarah. "Julie? She's here?" Sarah's voice rose, her face twisting with anger. "Does she even know what kind of liar you are? What kind of man she's sleeping next to?" John grabbed her arm, his voice turning cold. "You need to get out, now!" Sarah yanked her arm away, her body trembling with rage. "Don't touch me! Don't you dare touch me, John!" "Why are you doing this, Sarah? What do you want from me?" John asked, his tone exasperated but laced with a hint of desperation. "Money? An apology? What is it? Because nothing I say is going to change what happened." "I want you to admit it!" Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her face now, her voice cracking. "I want you to admit you used me, that you never cared about me, that I was just some temporary fix for your pathetic life." John's expression darkened. "You're being ridiculous. You think you were perfect? You think you didn't make mistakes? Maybe I needed Julie because I couldn't deal with how suffocating you are." The words hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. She froze for a moment, her mind reeling, before something inside her snapped. Her hands balled into fists as she took a step closer to him. "You have no idea what I gave up for you," she hissed through gritted teeth. "No idea. And you have the nerve to call me suffocating? Sarah, get out!" John's voice rose now, frustration overtaking his calm demeanor. "This isn't healthy. You need help." "You're the one who needs help," Sarah retorted, her voice low and icy now. "You're a parasite, John. A disgusting, selfish parasite who takes and takes until there's nothing left. And now what? You get to walk away and play house with her while I pick up the broken pieces of my life?" John took a step back, suddenly realizing just how far she'd been pushed. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, trying to soften his tone. "I'm sorry." Sarah stood frozen, staring down at John's crumpled body. The lamp slipped from her hands, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. Her breath came in sharp gasps, the adrenaline coursing through her veins refusing to abate. She hadn't meant for this to happen, hadn't even thought beyond the moment her anger boiled over. "John," she whispered, her voice shaking. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands hovering over his still frame. "John, get up, come on, this isn't funny," she said, her voice pitching higher with panic, but he didn't move. A small trickle of blood ran from the gash on his temple, staining the pristine beige carpet beneath him. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as the full weight of what had just happened hit her like a freight train. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "What did I do? What did I do?" Her mind raced, desperate to comprehend the situation. This wasn't supposed to happen. She'd come here to talk, to make him understand how much he'd hurt her. Not this, not violence, not something irreversible. In her panic she reached for his wrist, fumbling to find a pulse. Her trembling fingers barely functioned, but when she finally pressed them against his skin, she felt nothing. Her stomach dropped, and a loud sob escaped her lips. "No, no, no, this can't be real," she muttered to herself, rocking back and forth on her knees. Max's bark echoed faintly in her mind, but she couldn't focus on anything other than the lifeless figure in front of her. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands, her thumb hovering over the number 9, but she hesitated. What would she say? That it was an accident? That she hadn't meant for this to happen? Would anyone even believe her? Her mind snapped to Julie. Julie was still in the apartment. She'd said she was asleep. Sarah's eyes darted toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The sound of blood rushing in her ears was deafening, but she stayed frozen. Any second now, Julie would come out and find her standing over John's body. Sarah's survival instincts kicked in. She scrambled to her feet and pressed her ear against the bedroom door. There was no sound from within, and she realized she might still have time. Her movements became erratic as she looked around the apartment, her brain piecing together a terrible plan. What do I do? I can't go to jail. I can't let this be the end of my life, she thought frantically, pacing back and forth. She grabbed a throw blanket from the couch and draped it over John's body, as if hiding him from her own view would make the situation less real. She cleaned the lamp hastily, her hands frantically wiping away what she thought might be evidence. She didn't think. She only moved. Her entire body trembled as she shoved it back into its spot on the table. It no longer seemed like an object she'd owned for years, but a weapon in the most horrifying moment of her life. Julie's muffled voice startled Sarah out of her frenzy as it called from the bedroom. "John! What's going on out there?" Sarah froze, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might give away her location. She glanced at John's body, horror gripping her harder with each passing second. She needed to make a decision, and fast. Efforts to conceal the crime. The room was eerily quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock on John's wall. Sarah stood frozen, staring down at what she'd done. John's body lay lifeless on the beige carpet, a stark reminder that she couldn't go back. Her once simple world had shattered in one swift, irreversible moment of rage. Her heartbeat roared in her ears and her hands trembled uncontrollably as she whispered, "Oh my God, what have I done?" Max's barking from her car parked just outside barely registered in her ears. Panic gripped her like a vice, and every breath she took felt shallow and choking. It took her a moment to even comprehend that her body was moving. She knelt beside John, reaching out to check for a pulse, her fingers jittering as they pressed desperately against his neck. "Please, John!" she whisper-yelled, tears streaking down her face. "Please don't! Don't do this! Please get up!" But there was no response, no faint sign of life, no second chance to undo her mistake. Her mind raced, visions of police officers and courtrooms flashing before her eyes. Prison! My whole life is over. They'll say I'm a murderer, she thought, gripping the rug beneath her as if it would ground her spiraling thoughts. Oh God, my family, my friends. They'll know everything. Her wild gaze darted around the room, and then she shot up suddenly, pacing in quick, uncertain strides. Okay, I can fix this, she muttered to herself, running her hands through her hair as if trying to yank the thoughts into focus. No one knows I'm here. Julie didn't come out. No one's seen me. I can... She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes flickering to the blood-stained lamp lying next to John. The lamp, the weapon. No, I didn't mean to... Her voice cracked, then louder as if speaking would make it real. I didn't mean to kill him. But the truth stared back at her. She couldn't undo this, no matter how much she wished she could. She sank to her knees again, her fingers tugging at her hair as she whispered, "Think, Sarah. Think. You have to fix this." Her voice was ragged, her breathing uneven as adrenaline coursed through her veins. If no one finds him, if no one knows it was me... Her phone buzzed violently in her pocket, snapping her out of her trance. She fumbled for it, seeing Rachel's name light up the screen. "Rachel!" she murmured in disbelief, staring at the screen as if it were mocking her. She let it buzz again, then pressed ignore. She couldn't talk to anyone now. Not like this. Not when blood smeared her hands like a damning signature. The urgency to act overwhelmed her. Sarah glanced back at John's limp body, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. She covered her mouth with one shaking hand before forcing herself to her feet. She paced in tight circles, mumbling urgently to herself. Okay, remove the evidence, clean, move him, just get him out of here. If no one finds him here, they can't connect it back to me." Her voice trailed off when her eyes landed on a throw blanket folded neatly over the couch. She rushed over to grab it, then stumbled back to John's body, dropping to her knees as she threw the blanket over him. "I'm so sorry, John," she murmured through choked sobs, her hands shaking as she tucked the edges of the blanket closer to his body. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean any of it." She forced herself to move on autopilot, dragging the blanket with all her strength. John's weight shifted awkwardly against the carpet, nearly throwing her off balance. Her mind clicked into some distant logic mode. No blood on the floor. That's good. Carpet can't stain. Too much. Julie didn't see me. Did anyone see me come in? Cameras? I parked far away. Far enough. These thoughts looped mechanically in her head, though they offered no comfort. The hardest part was getting him to the car. It felt like hours, though it was only minutes. She fought against the dead weight, pulling him inch by inch with sweat slicking her skin and her muscles screaming. She glanced nervously at the door to the bedroom, her paranoia rising with every creak of the floor beneath her. Finally she reached her car, cracking the trunk open with numb hands. The dark, gaping space seemed like a cavern waiting to swallow John whole, the final piece of this nightmare she never thought she'd live. "Don't think about it," she whispered to herself, cheeks wet with endless tears. Just do it. Just fix it. Driving was the easy part, or at least that's what she told herself. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her foot pressing harder on the gas pedal than necessary. The road stretched endlessly before her headlights, the darkness outside pressing in like her own conscience. She barely noticed Max whining softly by her side in the passenger seat. Her destination was some forgotten wilderness just outside the city, the kind of place no one visited, the kind of place where nothing was ever found. Or found too late. John had once joked about it, she realized bitterly. Of course, it comes back to him even now. When she arrived, the silence hit her harder than it ever had. The quiet of the night suddenly felt oppressive, accusing even. She popped the trunk open with shaky fingers and tiptoed around the car's frame. The sight of John's covered body in her trunk sent her stomach lurching, bile rushing up her throat. "God," she whispered hoarsely, closing her eyes. "I can't do this. I can't do this." But then her voice steeled, her pain twisting into some warped determination. "You don't have a choice," she told herself firmly. "It's done. It has to be done." Dragging him out into the isolated woods triggered every fight-or-flight instinct in her body, though there was no one here to fight, nowhere left to run. She avoided looking down as she worked, and every sound of rustling leaves or nocturnal wildlife sent a jolt of new panic through her. The gas can in her trunk was next. It was as if her body moved without her. You never forget how to function when survival instincts take over. The smell of gasoline burned her nose, almost grounding her as she doused the sight with cold precision. Finally, she reached for the matches. Her hand hovered over the small cardboard box, her breath rattling from the weight of what she was about to do. The match flared orange in her trembling hand, and Sarah stared at it like it was fragile enough to save her, or end her entirely. "I'm so sorry, John," she whispered for the last time, and then she dropped the match. The orange flames mirrored the chaos inside her, the fiery destruction devouring all the evidence she possibly could, but no fire could burn away what was now lodged in her memory, etched in guilt, shame, and fear. As she drove away, Max whimpering softly in the passenger seat, Sarah told herself over and over, "It's over, it's over, this is the only way." But even as she whispered those words into the cold silence of the night, she knew nothing would ever truly be over. A grueling investigation and damning evidence. The smell of burnt wood and charred earth still lingered in the air when the detectives arrived at the remote site. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the cold morning wind as law enforcement officers carefully combed through the area. The lead detective, Mark Henderson, paced silently along the smoldering grounds, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. "This is no accidental fire," Mark muttered to himself, crouching down near a patch of scorched grass. His partner, Detective Claire Reynolds, approached, holding a small evidence bag containing a blackened scrap of cloth. "You were right," Claire said, her tone clipped but focused. She held out the bag. "Looks like some kind of fabric that didn't burn completely, possibly connected to the victim." Mark stood and sighed, his breath visible in the cool morning air. He scratched his chin and turned to the forensic officer nearby. "What's the report so far?" The officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a calm demeanor, gestured to the remains. "We've got partial human remains found in the ashes. Signs indicate a fire accelerant was used, gasoline most likely, and preliminary impressions suggest it's deliberate. Whoever did this wanted to wipe out all traces." Mark's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the charred ground as if the answer to the mystery lay buried beneath the dirt. "What about the body? Can we ID it?" The forensic officer hesitated. It's going to take time. Most of it's unsalvageable, but there are some dental fragments left and we'll run them against the missing person reports." Mark nodded grimly and turned to Claire. "Speaking of missing persons, what do we have?" Claire pulled out her leather-bound notebook and flipped through the pages. "We've got a report about John Miller, 23 years old, filed missing by his girlfriend Julie Richards 2 days ago. Seems like a night shift convenience worker, small-town guy. Fits the timeline for when this body could have been dumped here." "And the girlfriend, did she seem suspicious?" Claire shook her head. "Not at first glance, but here's the thing." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Julie mentioned John had another ex, Sarah Williams, mid-30s. Julie didn't outright accuse Sarah of anything, but she seemed unnerved at the thought of her. Said Sarah's been, well, kind of unstable since her breakup with John a few weeks ago." "Go on," Mark said, interested now. "She also said Sarah showed up at John's apartment unannounced a few days before John disappeared. Apparently John told Julie Sarah had been confronting him, making threats, and let's just say it didn't sound like Sarah was taking the breakup well. Sounds like motive, Mark said, rubbing the back of his neck, but we've got to connect her to this fire. Later that day, the detective sat across from Julie in the fluorescent-lit interrogation room. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but calm as she spoke. John said Sarah was obsessive, Julie explained, her voice trembling a little. She would call him constantly, leave messages, show up uninvited. It didn't stop, even when I moved in with him. Did John seem afraid of her? Claire asked gently, pen poised over her notebook. Julie hesitated, her gaze flicking between the two detectives. I think so, she admitted at last. But he didn't want to involve the police. He said Sarah was going through some stuff, that she wasn't dangerous, but I don't think she handled rejection well. Mark leaned forward, his sharp eyes studying Julie's face. Did you see Sarah at all in person recently, before John disappeared? Julie swallowed hard, nodding. Yes, it was late at night a few days ago. She came to the apartment screaming, saying John used her, that she wanted him to suffer for what he'd done. She didn't even care that I was there. I almost called the cops right then. And what did John do? Claire interjected. He went out to calm her down, Julie said quickly. They talked outside for maybe 15 minutes and then she left, but I think she was still furious. Do you think Sarah could have been involved in John's disappearance? Mark asked directly. Julie froze, looking down at her hands. I don't know, I mean, it sounds crazy, but she wasn't right. And now, John's gone. Her voice cracked at the end, and Claire passed her a tissue. With Julie's testimony raising suspicions, the detectives headed next to Sarah Williams' modest suburban home. As soon as they pulled onto the street, Mark's sharp gaze caught a red car parked out front. That's the car, Claire said, pulling up the license plate data on her tablet. That's Sarah's. Same vehicle spotted on traffic cams near the burn site a day before the fire. Looks like we've got her. Mark's fingers drummed against his thigh. We're not arresting her yet. Let's see what she has to say first. Sarah answered the door after the second knock, Max barking behind her. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep, but she forced a weak smile. Can I help you? Miss Williams? Mark began, pulling out his badge. We're Detectives Henderson and Reynolds with the LAPD. We'd like to ask you a few questions about John Miller. Sarah stiffened, gripping the doorframe. I don't know where John is, she said quickly. Mark and Claire exchanged a quick glance. We're just following up on the timeline, Claire said smoothly. When's the last time you saw him? I don't know, a couple of weeks ago? Sarah's voice wavered, her hands visibly shaking. What about the night he went missing? Mark pressed. Were you at his apartment? No, Sarah snapped, then immediately softened her tone. I mean, no, I wasn't. Why would I be? Mark studied her reaction intently, making a mental note of her erratic behavior before gently switching tactics. Your car was spotted in the area near John's apartment, and traffic cameras picked it up near a remote site where a body was located. Can you explain that? Sarah's breath hitched, and for a split second her mask cracked. I don't know what you're talking about. After Sarah closed the door, the detectives exchanged another glance. She's hiding something, Claire said, her voice firm, and I don't think it'll take long to crack her story. Let's pull her bank records, phone records, Mark added. If she's lying, we'll find it. Back at the station, forensic evidence began to pile up damningly against Sarah. Traces of gasoline found in her trunk, matching the accelerant at the burn site. Faint bloodstains missed during an initial cleanup. The partial dental remains identified the charred victim definitively as John Miller. Mark stared at the evidence board, his brow furrowed. She thought she could cover this up, leave no trace. He placed a photo of Sarah at the center of the board. But people always leave something behind, and this time it's going to put her away. The public trial and the downfall of the criminal. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied by journalists, curious onlookers, and anxious family members. The trial of Sarah Williams had become a media sensation. Nearly every newspaper called her the scorned lover-turned-murderer, while TV networks broadcast nightly segments dissecting her motives. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly together. She wore a plain black dress, her face pale and gaunt from months in county jail. Her attorney, Howard Baxter, leaned over to speak to her in a low voice. Stick to the script, Sarah. No outbursts, no distractions. The jury is already leaning against you. Don't give them a reason to hate you more. Sarah didn't respond. She kept staring at the courtroom door, half expecting John to walk through it like this was all some cruel dream. But he wouldn't. She'd made sure of that. The prosecutor, Dana Callahan, was relentless, known for her sharp interrogation skills and impeccable ability to sway juries. She stood up, smoothing her navy blazer, and began her opening argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice clear and commanding, "this case is about betrayal, obsession, and an act of violence that extinguished a young man's life. The evidence will show that Sarah Williams, unable to accept the end of her relationship with John Miller, planned and executed his murder in a calculated act of revenge." In her chair, Sarah flinched. Howard whispered calmly, "Don't react, they're watching everything." Callahan continued, pacing the floor. "You will hear testimony from Julie Richards, the victim's girlfriend, who will recount the threats and erratic behavior Sarah exhibited in the days leading up to John Miller's disappearance. You will see forensic evidence, DNA, surveillance footage, financial records that will leave no shadow of a doubt Sarah Williams is responsible for this heinous crime." She turned toward the jury, her tone softening but no less chilling. John Miller was just 23 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. That life was stolen, and today we are here to ensure justice is served. Howard rose and adjusted his tie as he began his defense. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone calm but firm, "this case is not as simple as the prosecution wants you to believe. My client, Sarah Williams, is not a murderer. What happened that night was tragic, yes, but it was an accident born out of uncontrolled emotions and manipulation. You'll see that Sarah was taken advantage of, used emotionally and financially, and pushed to a breaking point." Sarah felt the weight of the jury's eyes on her. She tried to look forlorn but not broken, a difficult balance her lawyer had repeatedly coached her on during pretrial sessions. The first day of testimony began with Julie Richards taking the stand. She adjusted the microphone nervously, avoiding Sarah's gaze. "Miss Richards," Callahan started, "can you describe Sarah Williams' behavior in the weeks before John's death?" Julie nodded, her voice shaky but growing stronger as she spoke. She was unhinged. She would call and text John at all hours. She came to his apartment late at night screaming at him, accusing him of things. I was scared of her." "And did John ever express fear of Miss Williams?" "Yes," Julie said, her voice breaking. "He told me she wasn't handling the breakup well, that she'd said things like, 'You'll regret this.'" Callahan walked toward the jury. "And on the night of John's disappearance, what happened?" Julie inhaled deeply. "She showed up again. Late, I was asleep, but John woke me up and said he'd go talk to her. He went outside, and that was the last time I saw him." Howard cross-examined her, trying to depict Sarah as emotionally distraught rather than violent. "Miss Richards," he began, "isn't it true that Sarah Williams believed John Miller had been using her financially, that she felt betrayed?" Julie hesitated. I guess so." "And isn't it also true that Sarah had no history of violence prior to this incident?" "Yes, but—" No further questions. The prosecution's next witness was Detective Mark Henderson. He presented the mountains of forensic evidence tying Sarah to the crime. "Detective Henderson," Callahan began, "can you explain how you linked Sarah Williams to the burn site where John Miller's body was found?" Henderson nodded, flipping through a report. Traffic cameras recorded her vehicle near the remote site. Gasoline traces matching the accelerant used in the fire were found in her car trunk. We also found remnants of John Miller's blood on the trunk carpet. Callahan lifted an evidence bag. "This lamp was recovered from John Miller's apartment with blood matching his DNA. Was this weapon tested?" "Yes," Henderson confirmed. "The blood and fingerprints belonged to both the victim and Sarah Williams." Callahan turned to the jury. "The defendant didn't just kill John Miller. She tried to destroy every piece of evidence. But no matter how hard she tried, the truth always leaves a trail." When it was Sarah's turn to testify, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Howard whispered as she sat down, "Stay calm, look remorseful. The jury needs to feel like you're human." Sarah gripped the edges of the witness stand, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen, I just wanted to talk." Her voice cracked. "I wanted him to know how much he hurt me." Callahan pounced during cross-examination. "Miss Williams, if you just wanted to talk, why bring a gas can? Why tamper with evidence? Why try to burn the body?" Sarah stammered, I panicked, I wasn't thinking clearly." Callahan's voice sharpened. "But Miss Williams, you thought clearly enough to cover your tracks, didn't you? To clean up your car, to lie to law enforcement? That's not panic. That's premeditation." Sarah's eyes widened. "No, it wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Callahan pressed, her voice fierce. "Were you enraged that John moved on? Furious enough to end his life?" "I loved him!" Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her face. The courtroom murmured and the judge banged the gavel for silence. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they eventually returned, the room felt suffocating with tension. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." He cleared his throat. We, the jury, find the defendant, Sarah Williams, guilty of second-degree murder. Sarah slumped in her seat, her face drained of color. Behind her, reporters rushed out to file breaking news reports, while Julie cried softly in the back row. Howard placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, whispering, "We'll appeal this. It's not over." But Sarah didn't respond. She stared blankly ahead, her life reduced to the ticking seconds until she would be led away in handcuffs. When the sentence came 3 weeks later, 20 years in a state prison, Sarah simply nodded, as if she had always known this was how it would end. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, she cast one last look at Julie and John's family, her lips trembling as if to speak, but no words came. For the world, the trial was over. Justice had been served. But for Sarah, her punishment was only beginning. The legacy of crime, a broken family, and belated regret. For Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, the heartache didn't begin in the courtroom. It began the moment Sarah confessed to her crimes. Even months later, as she sat at the edge of her bed, staring at an old photograph of Sarah as a child, the weight of that moment crushed her all over again. The picture was from Sarah's 7th birthday. It was a sunny day in Los Angeles, and Sarah held her cake with both hands, grinning ear to ear. Her blonde pigtails bounced as she tried to blow out all the candles in one breath. Elizabeth ran her thumb over the image, tears streaming down her face. "Where did it all go so wrong?" she whispered into the empty room. Her husband Robert had walked out weeks after Sarah's sentencing. He'd said their marriage couldn't survive the shame, the media attention, and the whispers from neighbors who looked at them like criminals themselves. Elizabeth hadn't fought him. She didn't have the strength. The house was eerily silent now, void of the voices and laughter that had once made it feel like a home. Even Sarah's sister Emily, who had always been her confidant and fiercest advocate, hadn't called in months. In the state prison where she now lived, Sarah stared at the gray concrete walls of her cell. The humming of fluorescent lights was endless, a constant reminder of just how far she'd fallen. She sat at the small metal desk clutching a worn envelope that had come in the morning mail. It was a letter from Emily. Sarah had read it 3 times already, unable to decide if opening it would bring comfort or rip the wound wider. Why would she even write? Sarah muttered to herself, running her fingers along the paper's edge. Eventually she gave in, sliding a finger beneath the seal to open it. Emily's handwriting was always meticulous, almost cold in its precision. "Sarah," the letter began, "I wasn't sure if I was going to write this. Part of me thought it would be better if I didn't, but there are things I want to say. Things I need you to hear." Sarah's eyes scanned the next paragraph, her stomach tightening with every word. "You made your choices, Sarah, and because of them, our family is broken. Mom cries almost every day, even though she'd never admit it out loud. Dad left. And me? I don't even know who I am anymore. Do you know how many times people have asked if I'm the sister of the murderer? It follows me everywhere, like a scar I can never cover up." "She's right," Sarah whispered, her throat tightening. The letter continued. "But more than that, I'm angry because you let everyone down, not just John. You let us down. You let yourself down. You let Max down. God, Sarah, Mom had to take him because no one else would. He sleeps by the door every night waiting for you to come home like none of this ever happened. Do you know how painful that is to watch?" The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. She let the letter slip from her fingers onto the desk and buried her face in her hands. She had tried so hard not to think about Max, the way he used to follow her everywhere, his soft fur a constant comfort during her worst days. And now he was waiting for her, but she was never coming back. Later that evening, during free time, Sarah sat in the corner of the common room, staring at the small window near the ceiling. Outside, the world carried on without her. People went to work, grocery stores buzzed with chatter, kids laughed in playgrounds. All the things she had taken for granted now felt like distant memories from another life. A fellow inmate sat down beside her, a woman named Carmen who had once been a teacher before a DUI accident changed her life forever. "You look like you're carrying the weight of all 9 circles of hell today," Carmen said, offering a sad smile. Sarah didn't reply at first, then she let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, I'm the architect of my personal hell, so I guess I've earned it." Carmen tilted her head. "Still thinking about the trial?" "Not just the trial. Everything," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "My mom, my sister, John's family. I ruined everything, for everyone. Don't you ever wish you could just go back? Undo it all?" "All the time," Carmen replied softly, her expression darkening. "But there's no use, is there? All you can do is decide who you're gonna be from here on out." Across town, Julie sat in her cluttered apartment, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. The ghost of John was everywhere, his t-shirt still folded in the drawer she couldn't bring herself to empty, the toothbrush next to hers in the bathroom, and photos tucked in the back of her phone's gallery that made her chest ache when she scrolled past them. Sometimes she found herself wondering if Sarah felt real remorse. The newspaper headlines certainly didn't capture it. They called Sarah a cold-blooded killer, but Julie couldn't help but imagine the hollow shell of a woman who had been so blinded by anger and hurt that she destroyed everything in her path. "She deserves to rot," Julie said to herself one night, tears streaming quietly down her face. But the sadness that followed spoke louder than the anger. For Sarah, the nights were the hardest. Lying on the narrow prison cot, she stared at the cracked ceiling above her as memories of John played in her mind. The sound of his laugh when he'd tease her about her choice of gum, the way they'd bonded over late-night conversations. But those memories weren't alone. They clawed viciously at the undeniable reality of what she'd done, his lifeless body on the floor, the blood on her hands, the sound of flames consuming it all. I loved him, she thought bitterly. So how did I destroy him? Elizabeth visited once a month, though her visits grew shorter as the burden of small talk in the cold prison visiting room became unbearable. This time she held Sarah's hand across the table, her grip tighter now than before. "You can't change what happened, Sarah," she said, though her voice trembled with unshed tears. "But you can still be better than this. You have to be. For yourself. For me. For your father. For Emily. For Max." Sarah looked at the ground, unable to hold her mother's gaze. "I don't even know who I am anymore, Mom. I thought I was someone good. Maybe I never was." "You were good," Elizabeth whispered. "Somewhere along the way you just got lost." The legacy of Sarah's crime rippled far beyond the courtroom. It was a crater in the lives of everyone she touched. A mother who mourned the daughter she once knew, a sister who carried the shame of a family name associated with headlines, a dog still waiting by the door for an owner who wouldn't return, and a victim whose life was extinguished too soon. And for Sarah, regret wasn't just an emotion. It was the living, breathing shadow that followed her every day, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what could never be undone. Reflections from Society. Lessons to consider. Sarah Williams' trial may have ended with a conviction and decades-long prison sentence, but the ripples of her actions extended far beyond the courtroom. It became not just a personal tragedy or a sensational media headline. Her story sparked a national conversation about the dangers of unchecked emotions, toxic relationships, and the fragility of trust in modern society. Morning talk shows dissected every detail of the case, psychologists were invited to weigh in, and social media was flooded with arguments as people tried to make sense of how an ordinary woman could spiral so far into desperation and tragedy. "I just don't get it," said Karen Yates, a host on Good Morning America, during a poignant segment covering the case. "How does a seemingly normal, successful woman go from being a productive member of society to committing such a horrendous crime? It's terrifying to think anyone could snap under the right, or should I say wrong, circumstances." Her co-host, Todd Granger, nodded thoughtfully. "What Sarah did is inexcusable, but you look at her backstory, her failed marriage, the financial strain, the sense of loneliness, and suddenly you're asking yourself, what role do these factors play in pushing someone to their breaking point, and could something like this have been prevented?" As society grappled with questions like these, experts began offering perspectives on the broader implications of Sarah's actions. "This is a textbook case of emotional dependency," explained Dr. Marla Silverman, a renowned psychologist, in an interview with the New York Times. Sarah clung to John because she saw him as her escape, a way to fill the emptiness left by her divorce and struggles with identity. When that escape was taken away, she blamed him and let her anger overwhelm her rationality. It's an extreme outcome, yes, but it speaks to a larger issue of how people deal with rejection and loss in their personal relationships. The article went on to examine the allure of toxic dynamics and how they can escalate. We often think toxic relationships are something that happen to a certain type of person, but the truth is, anyone can fall into an unhealthy dynamic if they're vulnerable enough, said Dr. Silverman. The challenge is knowing when to walk away, for both parties, and having the emotional tools to do it safely. Many also viewed Sarah's crime as a reflection of societal pressures on women, particularly when it came to relationships and self-worth. A Washington Post columnist, Rachel Hensley, wrote a scathing op-ed titled, "In Sarah's world, failure wasn't an option." She killed John Miller, yes, Hensley argued, but in many ways, Sarah Williams was a victim too, not of him, but of our collective obsession with success and perfection. She was taught that being divorced at 35 was a failure, that being alone was a failure, that admitting defeat was a failure. And so, she twisted herself into knots trying to erase those failures, even if it meant holding on to toxic relationships or making reckless decisions. Isn't that the lesson we teach women every day? Not everyone was so sympathetic. A viral Twitter thread from a self-proclaimed true crime junkie accused media outlets of softening the blow of Sarah's crime by framing it as a tragedy rather than cold-blooded murder. Sarah Williams killed a man because she couldn't handle rejection, one tweet read. It doesn't matter how lonely or sorry she felt, John Miller lost his life. Let's stop romanticizing criminals. Other users pushed back, arguing for a more nuanced view of the case. It's not about excusing her actions, one reply read. It's about understanding them so we can stop this from happening again. 2 lives were destroyed here, maybe more if you think about the families involved. Why aren't we talking about mental health? The community around John's family also grappled with the aftershocks of the crime. A candlelight vigil held in his memory drew hundreds of attendees, some of whom knew John personally and others who came to show solidarity. Julie Richards, John's girlfriend at the time of his death, gave a tearful statement to the crowd. John didn't deserve what happened to him, she said, clutching a framed photo of him from happier days. And I can't tell you how many nights I lay awake asking myself, could I have stopped this? Could I have done something differently to protect him? But it wasn't my burden, and it wasn't my fault. The only person responsible for this is Sarah Williams. Her words were met with solemn nods from the crowd and an outpouring of support online. Still, the broader question remained, how do we, as a society, prevent this kind of tragedy? For others, Sarah's story was less about murder and more about the fragility of human behavior under stress. A popular Reddit thread titled "What Snaps People" used her case as a prime example. I don't think Sarah was evil, wrote one user. I think she got lost in her own head, in her own pain, until nothing else mattered anymore. And honestly, that scares me. If someone like her, a normal person, can do this, what am I capable of when I hit rock bottom? This sentiment wasn't uncommon. Psychiatrists reported an increased interest in therapy from patients expressing fear over their own capacity for anger or stress. We're seeing more people reevaluate how they handle their emotions, one therapist told Psychology Today. Sarah's case reminded everyone that destruction doesn't start in a single moment, it builds over time. And when you don't address those feelings, when you let them fester, you risk becoming someone you don't recognize. Even years later, the case was referenced in university lectures on criminology and psychology. Professors used it to discuss not only the legal process but also the human element. How regret, remorse, and misguided love can converge into tragedy. Sarah isn't a monster, said Dr. Alan Frisk during a lecture at USC. She's a cautionary tale. She's what happens when we neglect to address the cracks in our emotional foundation. If you take anything away from her story, let it be this: never underestimate the power of unchecked emotion. The legacy of Sarah Williams' crime proved that a single act of violence is never isolated. It branches out, touching lives, sparking debates, and exposing flaws in the systems meant to protect us, both personally and as a society. For some, it was a reminder of the importance of seeking help before it's too late. For others, it was a sobering lesson in the consequences of ignoring warning signs. And for all who followed the case, it was a moment of reflection on the delicate balance between love, trust, and human fallibility. In the end, Sarah's story left the world grappling with this question. When emotions spiral out of control, who keeps us safe, from others, but most importantly, from ourselves? The hidden facets of modern life. The story of Sarah Williams didn't just end in the courtroom or on the front pages of newspapers. It opened a window into the dark corners of life in the modern age. Beneath the surface of her crime lay an intricate web of societal pressures, isolation, and emotional imbalance that millions of people experience, though few would admit. The isolation of modern relationships. In a world now defined by digital screens and endless scrolling, many people saw themselves in Sarah's situation, not as someone capable of her crime, but as someone desperate for connection. Experts on human behavior pointed to how modern relationships often leave people more isolated than ever, despite living in one of the most connected eras in human history. Dr. Lisa Monroe, a sociologist specializing in contemporary relationships, described Sarah's descent as a mirror of societal trends. On the outside, Sarah's connection to John might look like an unhealthy attachment, Monroe explained during an NPR segment titled "Disconnected Again." But underneath that is something far more relatable: fear of loneliness. In today's world, loneliness doesn't just feel like isolation, it feels like failure. For women like Sarah, who are already navigating societal pressures around marriage, career, and having a perfect life, losing a relationship can feel like losing everything. Callers flooded the NPR lines. One listener from Seattle shared how Sarah's story had dredged up her own painful experiences. "I had a breakup last year, and I almost didn't survive it," said the caller. "Not because the guy was so great, but because I felt like without him, I didn't exist. Everyone on social media looked so happy in their perfect lives, I felt like such a loser." Monroe responded gently, "We're seeing this more and more. People tying their worth to how their lives compare with others. Social media compounds this by showing us curated moments rather than real struggles. Sarah's story is a tragedy, but it's also a reflection of these modern pressures." The weight of silent struggles. The tragedy also highlighted how unchecked struggles, mental health, financial instability, and emotional wounds can fester until they explode. Sarah was the kind of person who, to the outside world, seemed fine. She didn't scream for help. She bore the weight of her pain alone. Nancy Lowry, a counselor based in Portland, reflected on Sarah's collapse during an appearance on The Today Show. "Sarah's spiral didn't happen overnight," said Lowry. "We know from the trial that she endured a divorce, financial pressures, and what seemed to be growing isolation. Her relationship with John may have acted as a bandage, but when that bandage was ripped away, everything she hadn't dealt with came bursting to the surface. That's what's happening to so many people today. They hide their wounds, thinking they're managing, but the unresolved pain doesn't just go away. It builds like steam in a pressure cooker." The show cut to an interview with one of Sarah's former co-workers, Melody, who described the subtle but telling changes in Sarah's demeanor during the months leading up to the crime. "She used to be so confident," Melody recalled. "She was quiet, sure, but always efficient, professional. And then, after her divorce, she seemed distracted. There were moments at lunch when she'd just stare off into the distance. We didn't think much of it, it's not like she was bursting into tears or anything, she just seemed tired." The invisible debt of emotional expectations. Another aspect of Sarah's story that struck a chord was the financial and emotional investment she poured into her relationship with John Miller. Many women identified with the feeling of giving so much of yourself to a partner, emotionally, physically, even financially, only to walk away with nothing. TikTok became a platform for these discussions, with the hashtag #SarahWilliamsStory gaining millions of views. Women shared their own tales of supporting partners who didn't reciprocate. "Spent $3,000 helping him get his car fixed. He ghosted me a month later. #SarahWilliamsStory," read one viral post. Others were less sympathetic. "She made the choice to give him her money and time," wrote one commenter. "You can't play the victim when you do that." But others pushed back. "It's not about the money. Sarah felt like she was investing in a future, something bigger than herself. When that dream shattered, she was left with nothing but anger and regret. That's what makes her story so tragic. The glamorization of productivity and perfection." Sarah's crime also brought attention to another hidden facet of modern life, the crushing weight of perfectionism. In a society obsessed with productivity, people like Sarah often found themselves running harder and faster just to keep up with their own expectations. Sarah was already battling feelings of failure after her divorce, said Dr. Kenneth Roman, a clinical psychologist, during a seminar hosted by the American Psychological Association. Add to that the pressures of maintaining a professional image, financial stability, and the constant comparison with others, and you've got someone teetering on the brink. One misstep in her personal life, and the facade cracks wide open. Roman linked Sarah's breakdown to what he calls the Instagram life syndrome, where people curate their lives to the point where they no longer feel real even to themselves. "The shocking thing is that Sarah also thought she had to keep up the perfect life," he continued. "She couldn't admit she was struggling. And that's something a lot of people relate to. We're all so busy looking successful that we miss the signals that our mental health is deteriorating." A wake-up call for modern society. Beyond the personal struggles reflected in Sarah's story, many saw it as a call for societal accountability. How often do we truly see the warning signs in others? How often do friends, co-workers, or family members dismiss small changes in behavior because we're too busy, too distracted? A podcast titled Lessons from the Sarah Williams Case explored these questions. In one episode, the host, Maggie Perez, interviewed experts on what individuals can do to prevent similar tragedies. "We need to start talking about mental health the way we talk about our work or the weather," remarked one guest, Dr. Theo Jacobs, a psychiatrist. Checking in on one another shouldn't be a rare or awkward thing. Sarah's case showed us just how much pain can hide behind a smile. Imagine if one person had sat her down and asked her, "Are you really okay?" That might have made all the difference. Perez chimed in, "It's not just on individuals though, right? Aren't there also gaps in our mental health care system? Shouldn't therapy, counseling, something have been more accessible to someone like Sarah?" Jacobs agreed. "Absolutely. If we want to tackle issues like this, society needs to make mental health care more than just a luxury for the few. It has to be integrated into our culture as something everyone takes seriously and has access to." Final thoughts. Sarah Williams's story is, in many ways, a reflection of our collective struggles as human beings in a fast-moving, hyper-connected world. It reminds us that life is often far more fragile than it seems, and that the pressures of modern life can push even the most normal among us to dark and dangerous places. Her actions were inexcusable, but the societal conditions that contributed to her breakdown are important to examine. If there's a lesson to learn, it's this: none of us are immune to the pressures of love, loneliness, and modern expectations. And perhaps as a society, we must do better at noticing pain, better at supporting one another, and better at addressing the cracks before they become chasms.